live long and prosper. So in this video series, I'm going to be talking through the social justice elements of every episode of the original series of Star Trek. The thing that inspired this project was actually a Fox News article which argued that Star Trek has in some way betrayed its traditional commitment to sort of political neutrality or middle ground by embracing progressive politics. In this series, we're going to see that Star Trek has always embraced progressive politics, and it's always been aspirational for social justice in various senses. I am taking a broad perspective on social justice here, so that may include multiple different types of social justice, whether that's racial, whether that's economic, whether that's religious, whether that's abilities, gender and sexuality, anything broadly considered. I will go through every episode. Some of the episodes I will interview fellow Trekkies and talk with them about it. And then below, in the descriptions, I will give you additional information about the episodes, particularly their original air date, who wrote the screenplay, and who directed that episode. I also want to dedicate this series to my dad, Michael Allen Zapkin. He was an OG Trekkie from back in the day, and it was watching the original series with him that I came to love Star Trek. In this video, we're going to talk about the episode By Any Other Name. This is an episode in which the Enterprise crew go to a planet responding to a distress call, and there they are met by Rojan and Kalinda, who are representatives of the Kelvan Empire from the Andromeda galaxy. Rojan, who my partner has insisted is actually called Turbo because she's decided that the Kelvans are the American gladiators. So Rojan promptly informs Captain Kirk that the Enterprise now belongs to them, and the Enterprise will be modified to take them back to the Andromeda galaxy in preparation for an invasion by the Kelvan Empire. Kirk, as you might imagine, is not real thrilled with this idea, but there isn't that much that they can do about it, because the Kelvans have this sort of neutralizing field. So they have these little devices on their belts, they just sort of push a button and the Enterprise crew are immobilized. They can also use the devices to condense the members of the Enterprise crew into these tiny little cubes, basically, of minerals and things like this. So there's not that much that Kirk and the other members of the crew can do. The Kelvans basically succeed in taking over the ship. There's half a dozen of them. There's Rojan, the leader, Kalinda, there's Hanar, Komar, and Drea. So this is like 5 that we see with names. And they basically modify the Enterprise, take it through the barrier at the edge of the galaxy, go out toward the Andromeda galaxy. They've reduced everybody in the crew except Kirk, Spock, McCoy, and Scotty to these cubes. So the 4 of them have to basically figure out how to get the ship back from these people that they can't really do much to resist. But what they have learned, because Spock made temporary mind contact with Kalinda, is that the Kelvans are not the humanoid beings that they appear. They have in fact taken on a humanoid appearance in order basically to live in our galaxy and to be able to use the Enterprise. But they actually look more kind of like eldritch horrors from H.P. Lovecraft and the sort of cosmic horror genre. Hundreds of tentacles, giant beings, incredible mental power, etc., etc. But what the Kelvans have sacrificed in order to get their incredible mental power, to cultivate their incredible mental power, is sensations. So they don't have particular experience of, like, touch, taste, smell, things like this, because the Kelvans have concentrated on their mental abilities and their desire for conquest. But the problem that they run into is that when they take on humanoid bodies experience sensations. And so the first sort of indication of this is when Kalinda picks a flower and she's, like, interested in this flower. But we don't yet know that that's important. When this sort of weakness or this change in the Kelvans becomes more apparent is when Tomar comes in to one of the dining areas where Kirk, Spock, McCoy, and Scotty are eating, and he's basically like, "Why do you eat this food when this little pill contains all the nutrients you need to survive?" And basically Tomar, like, tries some food, and he's like, this is good. I am enjoying this in a way that I am not used to enjoying things. At which point Scotty is like, yeah, I got this guy. I know how to overstimulate this guy. That basically becomes their plan, is they're going to overstimulate the Kelvans and, like, mess up their whole life world plan. So Scotty takes Tomar and they get really drunk. Like, they drink, like, between the two of them, they drink like 4 full bottles of liquor. That's a lot of liquor. They are definitely mixing colors of alcohol. The first one that they drink is a brandy. Then they drink something that's sort of kind of greenish yellow, like a kind of lemonade type color. Then they drink something that's dark green. And then finally, all that Scotty has left, his last bottle of alcohol that he has in his quarters, is one very, very old bottle of Scotch whiskey. And that's pretty much the way that James Doohan says it. It's a great scene, actually. Just these two guys getting super, super drunk. Because apparently Scotty just had 4 bottles of liquor in his quarters, which actually raises some pretty significant questions for, the engineer of a starship. So Scotty is overstimulating Tomar. Kirk, very naturally, is put in charge of overstimulating Kalinda, because Kalinda is supposed to be the sort of sexy love interest of this group of Kelvans. So Kirk basically seduces her somewhat awkwardly, because she's like, "Oh, you're trying to seduce me." And he's like, "Yeah, well, okay, you killed the mood, but, And Kirk and Spock sort of together overstimulate Rojan, because Rojan becomes jealous of Kirk making out with Kalinda, and Spock sort of prods him on to that jealousy. McCoy overstimulates Hanar basically by telling Hanar that his humanoid body is anemic, so he needs to give him shots. McCoy's actually giving him stimulants so that he'll sort of get increasingly jumpy and paranoid. And so that's what ends up happening. Basically, like, they just sort of destroy these Kelvans' control by using their sensory perception against them. And finally, at the end, Kirk and Rojan are just fist fighting one another in the recreation room over Kalinda, and Kirk is like, "Hey, maybe rather than going back to Kelvan where you're no longer properly Kelvans anyway. We could go back to my galaxy. I could talk to the Federation, and we could like find you a planet to live on. And Rojan's just like, yeah, man, that sounds awesome. Which is kind of a weird reaction, because in the initial meeting where Rojan was like, yeah, we're going to conquer your galaxy, Kirk is like, well, why don't we just like let you have a planet or something? And Rojan's like, no, we don't do that. So it's a little bit weird there. We've got kind of a very abrupt reversal of course on Rojan's part, which is not entirely explicable based on the overstimulation of his senses. So what's going on here in terms of social justice? Well, one of the things is we have, again, Kirk making out with an alien woman, so there's that sort of gender element to it. And I think that is important. And it's interesting the way that it's dealt with here, because in an earlier episode, Who Mourns for Adonais, we had Lieutenant, I can't remember her name. We had the lieutenant, the female lieutenant, who is in love with Apollo. But she has to, in order to get the Enterprise crew freed, she has to sort of pretend that she isn't actually in love with Apollo, that she's just been studying him. Here, we have kind of the opposite thing, where like Kalinda is legit like, oh, yes, I have researched this idea of love. And then Kirk kisses her and she's like, I don't understand this thing. And so there is that sort of weird like dichotomy of the intellect versus the emotion, and the ways that those things interplay. Kalinda clearly becomes the desired sort of point of contention between Kirk and Rojan. They are competing for her. They are competing for her affections. And that's significant because, again, that idea of like having possession of this person is really, really problematic. But where the episode slightly saves this is that at the end, it is Kalinda's choice whether or not she wants to go. Well, so Rojan offers her the choice. Does she want to go with Kirk, or does she want to stay with him and the Kelvans on this planet? Not real clear that Kirk wanted to actually have a long-term relationship with her, but so Kalinda does get to make that decision. So that's a good element here. There's another element in terms of like international diplomacy, right? Because the Kelvans are initially like, we don't colonize, we conquer. Kirk makes that offer. We can let you have a planet or some planets that you can have. And the Kelvans initially are not on board with this. But by the end of the episode, they are. So there is that interesting element of how you interact with other spaces, I guess, broadly speaking. The difference between, say, exploration in, I don't know, the commonly understood sense of like, I'm going to go out and look at stuff that hasn't been looked at, find stuff that hasn't been found. This idea of discovery as such, versus this idea of conquest. So the Americas weren't discovered by Europeans, but they were conquered by Europeans. Australia, not discovered by Europeans, but conquered by Europeans. New Zealand, same thing. This idea of going to a place and finding something unknown versus going to a place and killing the inhabitants and taking the thing. These are very different things, but they often do get sort of collapsed, right? We talk about, in the US at least, we traditionally have talked about Christopher Columbus as discovering America, but he didn't. There were millions of inhabitants of the American continents and the Caribbean when Columbus showed up. He didn't find something that was unknown. He just found something that Europeans didn't necessarily know was there. But then he conquered it. Well, he began the conquest of it. And that involved the slaughter of millions. 90-some% of the indigenous population of the Western Hemisphere died as a result of European conquests of these continents. And so there is this sort of problematic element of, like, what does it mean to go to a new place, and how do you interact with the things that you find there? Those sort of ethical problems, I think, are really, really significant for this episode.